Dawn had not yet broken. It was August 7th, 1944, 5:12 in the morning, and a gray, living hush lay over the hills around Mortain. Fog pooled in the valley like water in a basin, softening shapes, swallowing sound. The roads that threaded the countryside were thin veins of mud and light. The hedgerows and orchard trees stood like dark teeth against a dim horizon. In that half-light, 3 American units, 2 infantry platoons, and a forward artillery observer team huddled on a ridge they had been ordered to hold. A single Sherman tank and its crew were nested among them. 33 tons of steel and a 75mm gun. The last blunt argument between a shrinking pocket of men and the armored force closing fast from 2 sides. Lieutenant Carl Hartman was 24. Before the war, he had been an engineering student at the University of Michigan, a man who thought in blueprints and tolerances. He had joined the Armored Corps after Pearl Harbor because he trusted machines. Now, inside the cramped, clanking hull of his Sherman, Hartman felt that same methodical mind compress under the pressure of fog, radio static, and rumor. Around him were the ordinary faces of ordinary soldiers. Private First Class Earl Bishop, the gunner from Iowa. Corporal James Ortega, the loader with a nickname for every misfire. Specialist Anthony Tony Vitelli, the driver from Brooklyn who drove as if rules were polite suggestions. And Private George Marks, the radio operator. Too young to have stopped worrying. Orders had been straightforward the night before. Hold and wait. Reinforcements were on their way, and the ridge, with roads branching outward in 5 directions, mattered. The larger operation in the sector had a name in staff rooms and on maps, a German counterstroke. The transcript calls Operation Lüttich. Allied units had pushed east after D-Day. German command, described here as desperate but still lethal, was throwing elite armored formations into a gamble to cut Allied lines and retake ground. The ridge outside Mortain was a hinge point. Lose it. The lines could be severed. Under the cover of the fog, the enemy moved. In the hours before first light, a recon element found a gap and pushed through. By early morning, German armor and infantry were already in the folds of the valley, and the western road that should have been the American escape lay in enemy hands. Radios began to stutter with fragmented reports. Attempts to reposition were smothered by artillery. Units trying to withdraw were cut off. The phone lines of command had begun to fray. At 5:30, the world as these men understood it changed. An ordered defensive posture became, in a matter of minutes, a shrinking kettle. Inside the Sherman, the men worked with the narrow, practiced motions of crewmen who had learned to do an enormous job in a tight space. Hartman kept the voice of command in his ears. Hold your position. Do not engage. Reinforcements en route. The manual said the same. Discipline, control, keep the unit intact until higher orders arrived. Yet outside the periscope, men were running out of time. Stragglers came toward the tank in threads, wounded carried by comrades, medics dragging stretchers, officers shouting into dead channels. A forward artillery observer called in frantic requests for supporting fire. The answer from regimental headquarters was a cold calculus, negative. Risk of friendly fire too high. Maintain position. Hartman watched the terrain, measured wind and slope the way a man trained in structures measures strain and load. He could see movement in the tree line, short, squat silhouettes that resolved into panzer IVs, then more armor, then infantry. A German shell struck not far away, and the ridge answered with fire and flame. 10 minutes, then 5, the pocket closed like a fist. From the hatch, Hartman could see the men on the ground, young, limping, dragging lost comrades, and he felt a clarity that had nothing to do with doctrine. Command had gone silent. The map offered no plausible retreat. The Western Road, the only reasonable avenue of withdrawal, was already under German control. In his hand at that moment was a single shell they had been taught to treat, as a last resort, white phosphorus, a smoke round that burns and blinds and does not distinguish friend from foe. It was the kind of ordnance that training manuals reserved for emergency obscuration or target marking, never to be fired casually, and certainly not without authorization. Hartman had kept it for weeks, not because he craved rule-bending, but because he believed in contingency. Now the contingency was not abstract. It moved like steel and boots on the far slope. The scene tightens here, the crackle of radio static, the slap of exhausted boots on sodden ground, men slipping and falling. Hartman looked to his crew in quick private motion, to Bishop at the gun, Ortega by the breech, Tony with his hands on the drive levers, Marks with channels of silence and crackle. Orders from above said hold. Everything in the regulations said wait. But the men moving toward the Sherman were running out of daylight and help. Hartman thought of bridges, of load, of where pressure would give way, and he made a different calculation. A single shot could make the world opaque. One curtain of smoke might buy the minutes they needed. Before we move into the moment of decision, a quick note. If you want the full minute-by-minute account of what follows, the shell's flight, the wall of smoke, and the chaotic retreat it allowed, subscribe now and stay with us. In the next part of this documentary, we'll watch the forbidden shot arc over Mortain and the human choices that followed live and unvarnished. The morning fog thickened, turning the battlefield into a maze of whispers and motion. For hours the Americans on the Mortain Ridge had believed they were holding the high ground, a defensible position above the valley. But as dawn approached, the fog played its cruel trick. What seemed like high ground in the darkness was, in truth, a shallow depression, a bowl surrounded by German armor. Creeping through the mist. From the west came the low clatter of tank treads. From the south, muffled bursts of small arms fire. The first German reconnaissance elements had moved silently through the gaps in the night, exploiting every hollow and hedge. The 2nd S Panzer Division Das Reich, veterans hardened by the Eastern Front, was in motion, joined by units of the 17th S Panzer Grenadiers. They were fast, disciplined, and experienced in the kind of close, fog-bound fighting that stripped away the advantages of Allied air power. At 5 a.m., they cut the Western Road, the only clear escape route for Hartman's sector. At 5:20, artillery began to fall on the northern approaches, severing the link to the next American company. By 5:30, the men on the ridge were a disconnected island. No supply line, no reinforcements, no coherent chain of command. In the Sherman, the claustrophobic rattle of metal filled every silence. Lieutenant Hartman sat half out of his hatch, peering through the periscope while the others waited for direction. Private George Marks, the 19-year-old radio operator, had the headset pressed so hard against his ears that his skin was red and raw. The frequencies were chaos, overlapping voices, distant shouting, fragments of orders that made no sense. This is able to, we're hit, we're falling back. Can anyone hear command? We're surrounded. Hold position. Repeat, hold position. Then, only static dot to the south, Company K, about 30 men, tried to reposition. They had been placed just below Hartman's tank, tasked with guarding the slope. But the German infantry had already reached the tree line and were now less than 300 yards away. The Americans could hear them, boots scraping gravel, whispered commands in German. The harsh metallic slide of a weapon being readied. Hartman's gunner, Earl Bishop, watched through the main sight, adjusting the traverse with slow precision. 2 o'clock. 3 panzers, he muttered. Through the glass their shapes emerged, not shadows, not tricks of fog, real armor, short-barreled silhouettes of Panzer IVs. They're spreading out, Bishop said. They're hunting. Inside the tank, no one spoke. Every breath echoed in the confined air. Suddenly, a thunderclap of impact. A shell landed 200 yards away, throwing earth and smoke high into the air. The Sherman shuddered as dirt and fragments rained across its hull. That was close, Vitelli gritted, gripping the controls. Moments later, the radio came alive again, this time with the voice of a forward artillery observer somewhere down the slope. We're getting hit from the south. Multiple vehicles requesting fire support immediately. Command's answer came seconds later, flat and bureaucratic. Negative. Risk of friendly fire too high. Maintain position. Reinforcements are en route. The tone of the voice, calm, procedural, was the sound of distance. Whoever had said it was miles away, reading from the rulebook while men on the ridge fought to stay alive. Hartman turned down the volume and exhaled slowly. They're not coming, he said quietly. Ortega, his loader, looked up. What do we do, Lieutenant? Before he could answer, the ridge shook again, this time from the south. The German assault had begun. Mortar and machine gun fire erupted through the fog, their sounds muffled but relentless. Company K's line broke apart almost immediately. Men scattered for cover, dragging the wounded with them. The ridge, once a position of defense, was turning into a funnel dot through his periscope. Hartman watched helplessly as a German shell tore through the position where the artillery observers had been. A brief flash, a roar, then silence. Smoke and orange flame licked the air where men had been seconds before. They're gone, Bishop whispered. A message came through the chaos, a fragment from regimental command. Mortain sector compromised. Units to withdraw to phase line red. Repeat, fall back. Hartman froze. Phase line red was west, the same road now controlled by German armor. The order was suicidal. Fall back where? Vitelli muttered bitterly. Straight into them? No one had an answer. The Sherman sat half submerged in mud, its engine idling low, its barrel pointing toward the gray unknown. Around them, scattered groups of infantry began to retreat anyway, not in formation, but in survival. Some carried stretchers. Others limped alone, bleeding and wordless. A sergeant passed by with a radio on his back, his face streaked with soot and fear. He shouted, "The road's gone! The road's gone!" Before disappearing into the fog again, Hartman looked west, then south. Everywhere, the same story. German tanks advancing, American lines collapsing, no coordination left. For the first time, he allowed himself to think the unthinkable, but they were not going to hold this position at all. He dropped back into the turret, sweat streaking the grime on his face. "Tony, keep the engine hot," he ordered. "Earl, load armor-piercing. Targets?" Bishop asked. "Anything that moves in pairs," Hartman said grimly. They waited. The radio hissed, then fell silent again. In the lull, each man listened to the sounds around them, the squeal of boogies, the dull clank of metal on metal, distant cries that sounded human but might not have been. Dot fog blurred the boundaries between friend and foe. A few figures appeared in the gray, Americans running, waving frantically, but then the air cracked again with the flat, methodical rhythm of German machine guns. A dozen men fell within seconds. Inside the Sherman, no one cursed. No one spoke. Hartman's hand hovered near the back compartment, where a single shell lay separate from the rest. The white phosphorus smoke round, the one explicitly forbidden for unauthorized use. He had kept it for just in case. Outside, another explosion rolled across the ridge. The encirclement was nearly complete. The Germans were close enough now that Hartman could hear shouted commands in German, crisp, confident, organized. His crew looked to him for instruction. And for the first time that morning, he broke procedure. "Get that phosphorus shell ready," he said. Ortega blinked. "Sir, that's against." "I know exactly what it's against," Hartman said. "Load it anyway." They didn't fire it, not yet. But the decision, the first disobedient thought in a line of obedience, had been made. As the ridge continued to shrink, as the fog began to shift and the first orange rays of sun leaked through, 5 men inside a Sherman tank sat waiting, surrounded by the echo of orders that no longer made sense. The Germans were closing from the south and west. The air smelled of cordite and earth. The trap was nearly sealed. And the only thing standing between the encircled Americans and destruction was a tank commander holding a forbidden shell. A man about to make a choice that no manual could justify, but history would never forget. The ridge was dying. Every sound confirmed it. The deep, animal growl of tank engines, the rippling chatter of machine guns, the helpless radio calls dissolving into static. The Americans had been reduced to clusters of men clinging to fragments of cover. Mortar bursts lit the fog like lightning inside a storm cloud. And for each new flash, there was less left to hold. Inside the M4 Sherman, Lieutenant Carl Hartman leaned forward in the commander's seat, his gloved hand gripping the edge of the hatch. The smoke round, the one with the red ring painted around its casing, rested against the wall, untouched. Its label read, SMK, white phosphorus. For concealment use only. It might as well have been labeled last chance. He could see them now, moving in the mist, German armor advancing, 2 panzer IVs abreast, another behind. Infantry followed in their wake, rifles held ready. The sound of treads grinding through the damp soil drew closer, deliberate and patient. The Germans knew the ridge was trapped. There was no rush. Inside the tank. Private First Class Earl Bishop adjusted the elevation on the main gun. "They're closing in, sir," he said quietly. Hartman didn't answer. His eyes were on the horizon, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the wind. The slope of the terrain, the distance between his position and the German line. He was doing what engineers do, calculating, measuring risk by instinct and angle rather than by order. Do not engage unless fired upon. That had been the last instruction from command. A sentence that now sounded absurd, like asking men to stand still in a burning house. A sudden blast shook the tank. A German shell hit short, close enough to rattle the periscope and shower the Sherman in mud. The next shell landed closer. Dirt and stones clattered against the armor like hail. "They've got the range." Ortega, the loader, muttered. Hartman looked at him, then back at the smoke shell. The clock in his head was ticking. Every 30 seconds, more men on the ridge were dying. What if we fire the smoke? Ortega asked quietly. Bishop turned from the sight. The phosphorus one? Yeah, it could cover the withdrawal. Vitelli barked a laugh, short, humorless. Or it could burn us all alive if the wind changes. Hartman looked up through the periscope again. The smoke from burning vehicles drifted west, steady, almost lazy. He felt it too when he cracked the hatch and let the air in. A slow wind from east to west. Not strong enough to shift direction. Consistent, reliable. He made his choice. Load white phosphorus. Hartman ordered. Ortega hesitated. Sir, we're not authorized, I know. Command's not here, Hartman snapped. We are. Silence fell. The crew exchanged glances, each man weighing the same question. What if this kills us all? Then, one by one, they nodded. Loading white phosphorus, Ortega said finally. He reached into the compartment, hefted the shell, and slid it into the breech. The metallic click echoed like a lock closing on fate. Outside, the fog swirled in low curls around the burning remains of an American observation post. The ridge smelled of cordite, oil, and fear. Hartman leaned half out of the hatch, scanning the terrain. In front of him, the valley sloped downward, a bowl filled with gray vapor and the silhouettes of moving men. Behind him, up the hill, the scattered remnants of 2 platoons were trying to regroup, dragging wounded and broken radios. He knew they had less than 5 minutes before German tanks cut them off completely. His voice dropped to a murmur. If this works, it'll buy them time. If it doesn't, Bishop interrupted, his hand steady on the firing controls. It'll still look impressive. A small grin flickered across the lieutenant's face. That's the spirit. He ducked back inside, checked the wind direction once more through the periscope, and then gave the only order that mattered: fire. The gun barked with a deep, rolling thump. The Sherman rocked backward as the round left the barrel, a streak of white that vanished into the fog within seconds. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, just the ringing in their ears and the faint whine of the recoil system resetting. Then the world outside erupted 50 yards out. The shell detonated midair, scattering white phosphorus into the mist. The chemical reaction ignited instantly, filling the field with a thick, searing gray smoke. It was not the gentle veil described in manuals. It was alive, roiling, crawling along the ground and expanding outward like a living creature. Within seconds, visibility dropped to nothing. The line between friend and foe vanished in the haze. Hartman watched through the periscope as the battlefield changed. The advancing panzers slowed. German infantry stopped mid-step. The formation hesitated, unsure if they were walking into an ambush or a trap. Look at that, Ortega whispered. They're stopping. The lieutenant didn't answer. He was too busy calculating the direction, the thickness, how long the smoke might last. It was spreading westward, just as he had hoped, rolling down the slope and into the German approach routes. Tony, he said to his driver. "Hold position. Don't move until I say." Outside, the cries of the wounded faded under the new sound, a steady hiss, like steam from 1,000 pipes. The ridge disappeared. Men who had been exposed a minute before now moved unseen. The smoke had turned the battlefield into a blank page. Hartman keyed his radio. "All units, this is Old Hickory Tank," he said. "Use the smoke. Move west now. Move now." The response was chaotic, fragments of voices, confusion, but then it began. Through the fog, dark shapes moved. Infantry breaking cover, medics carrying stretchers, officers waving men forward. The entire ridge seemed to come alive, sprinting into the gray. Bishop looked up from the sight. "You think they'll make it?" "They'll make it if the Germans stay blind," Hartman said, "or if they don't start firing through it," Ortega added as if on cue. A burst of machine gun fire ripped from the left flank, blind, panicked, spraying into the fog. Another gun joined in. Then, from the southern slope, the deep bark of a panzer cannon echoed. The shell passed somewhere overhead, unseen. "Return fire," Hartman ordered. "Suppress only. Make them think we're still dug in." The Sherman 75mm gun roared again, firing a high explosive round toward the flashes. The explosion rolled through the mist, lighting the smoke briefly from within. A ghostly flash, gone in an instant. "Good," Hartman said. "That'll keep them guessing." For 90 seconds, neither side advanced. The Germans, convinced they faced a counterattack under the cover of chemicals, halted to regroup. And in those 90 seconds, nearly 200 Americans crossed the ridge and slipped into the safety of the rear line. Inside the tank, Hartman's crew watched the timer on the smoke fade. Bishop's voice was hushed. "Sir, that actually worked." Hartman exhaled for the first time in minutes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It worked." No one cheered. There was no triumph, only relief. The smoke was still thick, curling, unpredictable. They could hear movement behind them, men retreating, boots pounding the earth, breath ragged. But for once, those sounds were not fear. They were surviving. Hartman knew what came next. Once the last man cleared the ridge, his crew would have to follow, the last to move, the last to risk the crossing. He turned toward Ortega and Bishop. "Keep the turret rotating," he said. "Make them think we're covering the retreat." Outside, a gust of wind rippled the smoke, revealing glimpses of the shattered ridge, burning trucks, blackened trees, the lifeless stillness of those who hadn't made it. Hartman closed the hatch and stared at the map on his lap. Phase line read. The fallback line that had been suicide minutes earlier now stood a chance. Behind him, Vitelli gave a low laugh. "Next time someone says we're out of options," he muttered, "I'll tell him to wait for the wind." Hartman smiled faintly but said nothing. He looked through the periscope one last time. The smoke rolled on, steady and merciful. It was buying them time, not victory, but something rarer, a second chance, and for Lieutenant Carl Hartman, that was enough. The first few seconds after the smoke shell burst were confusion itself, a silent, disorienting blindness that turned the battlefield into an alien world. One moment, there had been shapes, silhouettes, direction. The next, only a shifting ocean of gray. Men who had been crawling through mud found themselves invisible, their fear suddenly muffled beneath the hiss and curl of white phosphorus. For the German units pressing up from the valley, the sudden eruption of smoke was a puzzle. Their forward observers had reported a shattered American position minutes earlier. Now the ridge had vanished. The leading panzer IVs halted. Infantry dropped to their knees, scanning through the vapor for movement. A platoon commander peered through his field glasses and saw nothing but rolling fog. To him, it looked like the prelude to something worse, a counterattack or artillery strike. The advance froze. Inside the Sherman, Hartman kept his eyes on the periscope, scanning for any break in the smoke curtain. "They're holding," he muttered. "They don't know what's happening." Bishop adjusted the gun slightly, ready to fire again. "You want another round, sir?" "Negative," Hartman said. "Let it breathe. The more they wait, the more time we buy." He switched to the radio. "All units, move west now. Follow the smoke. Keep low. Stay quiet." The transmission crackled through the static, carrying with it a fragile thread of hope. At first, nothing happened. Then, through the periscope, he saw motion. American infantrymen, small, darting shadows, breaking from cover. Some were carrying wounded over their shoulders. Others dragged rifles by the barrel. A few stumbled, coughing violently from the chemical haze, but they kept moving. The ridge was alive again, not in defense, but in flight. To the Germans, the movement was invisible. The smoke did its job with cruel perfection. From their vantage point, the entire slope appeared empty, a smoldering void. Their hesitation deepened. Orders passed uncertainly between radio operators. The longer they waited, the more the initiative slipped away. Behind the curtain, the retreat turned into a desperate exodus. Men ran with heads low, guided only by shouts and instinct. Medics carried stretchers through terrain they could barely see. A machine gun crew abandoned their weapon, choosing life over equipment. In the confusion, rank no longer mattered. Captains and privates alike moved as one, trusting the smoke, trusting that somewhere ahead there was still safety. Inside the Sherman, Hartman's crew played their part as rear guard. The tank's engine idled low, its gun trained toward the unseen enemy. "Keep the turret rotating," Hartman said. "Make them think we're still here in force." Bishop obeyed, the massive barrel moving left, then right, slicing through the fog like a metronome. Ortega kept his hand on the next shell. Vitelli stared at the faint glow of the dashboard lights, jaw clenched, ready to move the instant the order came. Outside, a German machine gun finally opened up, a blind burst through the smoke, the bullets whistling harmlessly into nothing. Another followed, then a third, each firing at ghosts. Hartman's response was immediate. "Return suppression fire, 1 He shell, low trajectory." The gun thundered. The explosion tore through a thicket, lighting up the gray world with orange for an instant. The Germans stopped again, certain now that they faced resistance. Fear replaced momentum. They called for artillery support, wasting precious minutes waiting for confirmation that never came. That hesitation was the difference between life and death. In those minutes, the retreat became a miracle of motion. From ridge to valley, through the dense veil of smoke, nearly 200 men passed unseen. Private Harold Jensen, shot through the shoulder, was carried by 2 others who could barely breathe but refused to drop him. Sergeant Eli Rowe, who had manned the radio at the forward post, used his belt to drag a wounded comrade uphill by one arm. The smoke stung their eyes and burned their throats, but no one stopped. From the Sherman's narrow vision slit, Hartman watched them move, silhouettes flickering like shadows across the shifting gray. For everyone he counted disappearing west, he felt the pressure in his chest ease just a little. At last, only a handful remained, the last squad from Company K, burdened with stretchers and gear. One soldier waved toward the tank. "They're closing in," he shouted through the haze. "You have to go." Hartman waited until he saw them vanish into the fog before nodding to his driver. "All right, Tony, punch it." The Sherman lurched forward, its treads grinding against broken earth. It moved slowly at first, then faster, the fog swallowing it whole. The world outside was nothing but smoke and the hiss of burning phosphorus. Occasionally, the outline of a fallen jeep or shattered tree would flash past in the dim light. A sudden burst of machine gun fire cracked from the right flank. Bullets ricocheted against the hull with a ringing clang. Vitelli swore under his breath. "They're shooting blind, sir." "Return suppression, one shell," Hartman said calmly. Bishop fired. The explosion rolled through the haze, a deep, muffled thud, and the gunfire ceased. Silence reclaimed the ridge once more. They pressed on, the tank advancing through its own wall of smoke, guiding itself by instinct and faint echoes of movement ahead. After 3 long minutes, the gray began to thin. Daylight leaked through, weak, filtered by the morning mist. Then, through the last wisps of smoke, they saw it, the American fallback line. Trucks, stretchers, and exhausted men clustered behind sandbags and overturned crates. As the Sherman crested the final ridge, cheers erupted. Soldiers waved, medics ran forward, and someone shouted, "They made it." The tank made it. Hartman stood in the hatch, eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. He raised one hand, not a salute, not quite a wave, and watched as the last curls of white smoke drifted away behind him. The ridge they had abandoned was invisible now. Hidden beneath the same haze that had saved them, the crew shut down the engine. Silence, only the crackle of burning trees. Far away, and the faint coughs of men breathing in clean air for the first time in hours. Vitelli leaned back against the turret wall, wiping soot from his face. "You think command's gonna like what we just did?" he asked. Hartman gave a tired smile. "I think they'll like that we're alive." Outside, the smoke still rolled over the hills, a pale, shifting monument to defiance. Behind it, the Germans hesitated just a little too long. By the time they realized, the ridge was empty. The Americans were gone, the encirclement had failed, and the ridge at Mortain, a place that should have been a graveyard, had become the site of one of the quietest miracles of the Normandy campaign. When the smoke cleared, Mortain looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The ridge was scarred and silent, littered with broken weapons, burnt-out vehicles, and the dark outlines of craters still steaming in the cool morning air. But amid the wreckage, nearly 200 American soldiers had lived to see another sunrise. Lieutenant Carl Hartman's Sherman rolled to a stop behind the new defensive line. Its hull blackened with soot, its crew gray with exhaustion. Medics moved among the survivors, checking wounds and distributing canteens. No one spoke much. The men who had escaped the ridge did so with a kind of stunned disbelief, not cheering, not celebrating, just breathing. A few hours later, word began to spread through the 30th Infantry Division. A single tank had somehow broken the German encirclement. Rumors ran wild. Some said the tankers had used captured enemy smoke. Others claimed an airstrike had intervened. The truth that it had been one unauthorized white phosphorus shell and a perfect wind seemed too improbable to believe. At regimental headquarters, officers struggled to piece together what had happened. Reports were contradictory. The communications logs were a mess. Dozens of units had lost radio contact for nearly an hour. Yet the numbers told their own story. Company K and the attached artillery team, presumed lost, were alive. Only 14 men were seriously wounded. None of the forward observers had been killed. By the afternoon of August 7th, the official dispatches began to call the event an unexpected withdrawal under adverse conditions. But the talk among soldiers was simpler. That smoke saved us. It did not take long for the incident to reach divisional command. By evening, a message arrived at Hartman's unit. Lieutenant Carl Hartman and crew report to field headquarters immediately. They went reluctantly, uniforms still stained, eyes rimmed red from fatigue. The headquarters was a commandeered farmhouse just behind the line, its windows shattered by an artillery blast. Inside, the mood was formal and cold. Around a folding table sat 3 officers: Colonel Raymond Sloan from division staff, a career disciplinarian known for his adherence to protocol; Major Harold Aniston, operations officer for the 30th Division, and a stenographer seated quietly at the end of the room. Sloan began without preamble. "Lieutenant Hartman," he said, flipping through a clipboard, "you deployed white phosphorus without authorization." His voice was clipped, bureaucratic, impersonal. "You had no clearance for chemical obscurants, no coordination with supporting artillery or air elements. That is a direct violation of standing engagement rules." Hartman stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand the risk you placed on nearby friendly positions if the wind had shifted?" "Yes, sir." "Fully aware. Then why?" Sloan asked flatly. Hartman's answer was as simple as the act itself. "Because we were surrounded, sir. Command was out of contact. I believed the smoke would delay the enemy long enough for our men to withdraw. And it did." There was silence. The only sound was the soft tapping of the stenographer's typewriter keys. Major Aniston leaned forward, his expression softer. "Sir," he said, addressing Sloan, "the reports confirm 192 personnel were saved because of that decision, including all 3 forward observers. Without that smoke, we'd have a massacre on our hands." Sloan looked at him, then back at Hartman. His face did not change, but something in his tone eased. "You'll receive a formal review," he said, "but unofficially." He paused. "Well done." That was it. No applause, no commendation, just a quiet acknowledgment that something had gone right in the chaos. The review itself would take days, but the decision was already made. No reprimand, no punishment. The file would note that Lieutenant Hartman had acted outside standard protocol, but in accordance with battlefield necessity. When Hartman stepped outside, the light was fading. The sound of distant artillery echoed over the fields. His crew waited by the tank, still unsure of their fate. "Well?" Vitelli asked. Hartman shrugged. "We're not in trouble." "Not yet," Ortega said. "No," Hartman replied, his voice quiet, almost tired. "Not this time." That night, as the men of Old Hickory dug in along the new line, the Battle of Mortain continued to rage around them. The German counterattack, bold and desperate, would ultimately fail, beaten back by a combination of Allied resistance and, when the skies cleared, overwhelming air power. But the small action on that ridge, the one no map recorded and no communiqué celebrated, had already entered the division's unofficial folklore for the survivors. It was simple. A tank fired a smoke shell. And we lived out in the coming weeks. The story spread beyond the regiment. Other armored crews heard about the tank that saved 2 platoons. Hartman didn't talk about it. He never called it heroism, never described it as defiance. When a fellow officer asked him later what made him take the risk, he said only, "The wind was right." The review board's verdict came 5 days later. The report was clinical, but its conclusion was clear. Lieutenant Carl Hartman acted outside standing orders in the employment of white phosphorus munitions, but his actions demonstrated sound tactical judgment under battlefield duress. No disciplinary action recommended. It was a quiet exoneration, one that would never make the papers, never be mentioned in dispatches, but which changed something subtle in the doctrine of armored warfare for the men who had walked through that smoke and survived. The verdict didn't matter. They didn't care about manuals or regulations. They cared that someone in a tank had seen their lives as worth the risk. In the months and years that followed, the Battle of Mortain became just another line in the long list of engagements that shaped the Normandy campaign. It was studied for its strategy, for how the German counterattack known as Operation Lüttich faltered under the combined weight of Allied coordination and air power, but buried within those reports, often in a single understated paragraph, was a smaller story. 1 tank, 1 smoke shell, 1 lieutenant who broke the rules and saved nearly 200 men, for the soldiers who had lived through it. However, that small story was the battle. They had seen the ridge turn from a trap into a second chance, not because of overwhelming firepower or command brilliance, but because one man decided to act when silence from above could no longer dictate survival. In the weeks after Mortain, rumors of Hartman's smoke spread quickly through the 30th Infantry Division. Tank crews asked for details. How far had the smoke spread? How long had it lasted? And what was the wind direction that morning? Engineers wanted to know if the phosphorus had burned through the brush or ignited secondary fires. Every retelling added its own edge. Some made Hartman a maverick genius, others a lucky fool. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. He was an engineer who calculated risk and trusted his judgment. That judgment began to shape doctrine. A quiet memo circulated through several armored battalions later that autumn. It authorized field commanders, under extraordinary circumstances, to employ smoke at their discretion when communication with higher command was lost, or when the act increased the survivability of their units. It was not an official rewrite of policy, but it was the Army's way of admitting that flexibility could save lives. Training manuals began to evolve. At Fort Knox, instructors revising the Armored School field notes included a short case study titled Employment of Smoke for Concealment Under Combat Conditions. The names were omitted, but the scenario was unmistakable: a trapped unit, a single tank, a wind shift calculation, and a successful withdrawal. The lesson was clear. Initiative and observation could be as decisive as obedience. Historians would later point out that the psychological dimension of Hartman's action was perhaps its greatest contribution. A post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Historical Division cited captured, German reports describing the event from the other side. One entry in a Das Reich officer's field log read, "Visibility ceased suddenly. Enemy position unclear. Believed possible chemical barrage. Ordered halt to advance pending clarification." That halt lasted nearly 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, the Americans escaped the pocket. The analysts drew a conclusion that went far beyond Mortain, that in modern warfare, perception could be as potent as firepower. Smoke, in this sense, became a weapon of psychology. It created fear of the unseen, hesitation in the trained mind, paralysis in the face of uncertainty. Lieutenant Hartman hadn't just obscured his men. He had obscured the enemy's confidence. The ripple effect continued quietly. By late 1944, armored units across Europe were using smoke rounds more dynamically, not merely as retreat tools, but as tactical assets. Tanks deployed them to confuse rangefinders, to mask flanking maneuvers, to isolate pockets of resistance. The manuals no longer call such use unauthorized. They called it adaptive. Yet outside the professional military circles, no one ever heard of Carl Hartman. There were no front-page stories, no newsreels, no grand citations. The battle itself was overshadowed by larger victories, the closing of the Falaise pocket, the liberation of Paris, the push across the Seine. But in the diaries and letters of men who survived Mortain, the story endured. Private Harold Jensen, one of the wounded who had been carried through the smoke, wrote to his wife weeks later from a hospital in England, "I don't know the name of the man in the tank who fired that smoke, but I know this. I owe him everything. We all do." That letter, preserved decades later by the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, became one of the few first-hand testaments to the event. Another survivor, Corporal Elias Ford, published a short memoir in 1949. It was a chapter titled "The Wall of Smoke." He described it as a gray curtain that turned. Dead men walking into living ones again. His words carried no military jargon, no mention of phosphorus or protocol, only the memory of sight returning through the haze, and the feeling of running toward life instead of waiting for death. For those who knew Hartman personally, the legacy was more private. When he was reassigned in September 1944, his reputation followed him, the officer who had bent a rule and gotten away with it. Younger tank commanders sought him out for advice. He never bragged, never explained more than necessary. "Watch the wind," he'd tell them. "And don't wait too long to do what you already know is right." After the war, his story drifted into obscurity, as most quiet acts of battlefield judgment do. The Army had thousands of official heroes decorated for valor under orders. Hartman's courage was different, not disobedience for its own sake, but obedience to a higher kind of reason, the duty to think when others froze. When military historians revisited the Normandy campaign decades later, a few rediscovered his file. They noted how doctrine had changed subtly after Mortain, how smoke rounds were reclassified, how armored tactics had become more flexible. They traced the shift back to that one line in the after-action report. Lieutenant Hartman acted outside standard protocol, but in accordance with battlefield necessity. The phrase battlefield necessity would appear in dozens of reports after that. A quiet acknowledgement that sometimes survival depends not on rules, but on judgment. In the end, the legacy of that day wasn't just in the doctrine or the paperwork. It lived in the memory of those who breathed that choking. stinging smoke, and found that it led not to death, but to deliverance. It was the legacy of an engineer who saw patterns where others saw panic, who trusted math and instinct in equal measure, and who believed, perhaps more than anyone else on that ridge, that courage sometimes meant bending the straight line just enough to save it from breaking. The war ended, but for Lieutenant Carl Hartman, the noise of it never truly did. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, he came home to a quieter country, one eager to rebuild, to forget the roar of engines and the smell of burning fuel. Hartman, like many veterans, returned without ceremony. He did not wear his bronze star on the train ride home. He did not tell anyone that the medal had been handed to him without words. At a quartermaster's desk, alongside a stack of paperwork, he went back to what he had loved before the war: engineering. The boy who had once written to his father about playing God with bolts and numbers picked up where he had left off. By 1947, he was back at the University of Michigan, sitting again in classrooms where bridge stress diagrams had replaced battle maps. His professors noted his quiet precision, his near-obsessive focus. What they did not see, what he never mentioned, was that those same equations had once kept him alive. Hartman graduated and took a job in Detroit designing vehicle safety systems. There was irony in it. The man who had used a weapon designed for destruction now spent his life creating machines that could absorb impact and protect the people inside. He specialized in crumple zones, reinforced frames, and new alloys that bent under pressure but did not break. Every calculation, every test, was about buying time in the face of disaster, about giving people, as he once had on that ridge, a second chance. He married in the early 1950s, raised 2 children, and rarely spoke of the war. When his son once asked him, "Dad, what was it like to fight in a tank?" Hartman simply said, "Loud, hot. You learn to make decisions fast." That was all. His wife sometimes caught him standing at the window on quiet evenings, looking out toward nothing in particular, his hands clasped behind his back. When she asked what he was thinking, he'd answer with a small smile, "Wind direction." She never pressed further. The years turned into decades. The Bronze Star gathered dust in a drawer. His crew went their separate ways, Bishop to Iowa, Ortega to California, Vitelli back to Brooklyn. They exchanged a few letters at first, then silence. Time, like war, has its own kind of attrition. But Hartman kept one thing with him always: a single 75mm shell casing, polished to a dull shine, sitting on his desk. When colleagues asked about it, he would say only engineering inspiration. None of them knew it was the empty casing from the smoke round he had fired at Mortain. In 1986, at age 62, recently retired, he wrote a long letter to his younger sister. It was meant to be a reflection on life, the career he had built, the family he had raised, the peace he had found. But in the middle of that letter, between notes about bridge designs and car safety, he wrote about one morning in 1944 that he could never forget. August 7th, 1944. "I can still smell the smoke. Not the burning kind, the kind that hides you, that wraps around you like a second chance. We weren't supposed to use it. We were supposed to hold the line, follow orders, and die like good soldiers if needed. But something about watching those men out there, scared, bleeding, still trying to carry each other, I couldn't let them die for the sake of protocol. That day, The battlefield taught me something no manual ever could. Sometimes the only right choice is the one they didn't teach you to make. He never published those words. The letter was found years after his death, folded neatly among family papers. His children donated it, along with his crew photo and that single shell casing, to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Today, it rests in a small display titled Split-Second Decisions, Tactical Genius in the Field. Visitors rarely linger long at that case. It sits quietly among maps, field manuals, and photographs, just another story among thousands. But if you read the plaque beneath the photo, you'll find a simple summary. Lieutenant Carl Hartman, 30th Infantry Division. Mortain, France, August 7, 1944. Employed smoke to enable the withdrawal of encircled units. The decision is credited with saving 192 lives. There are no grand statues of Hartman, no film adaptations, no speeches in his name, but perhaps that is fitting. His victory was never about glory. It was about judgment. It was about a man who trusted his training enough to know when to outgrow it. Somewhere over the hills of Mortain, the wind still moves west in the mornings. The fog still gathers in the valleys, and the fields where the ridge once stood are quiet again. The smoke that saved so many has long since drifted away, but its meaning lingers, a reminder that courage is not only in defiance, but in understanding when defiance becomes duty. Because sometimes history does not remember us for what we were ordered to do, but for what we chose to do when no one else would.